It's not just busing, obviously, that is going to be an issue, or these lunch counters. Schools are also going to continue to struggle in terms of racial segregation. As of 54, the schools had been ordered to desegregate. All schools were supposed to be black, white, purple, every color mixed together. That being said, many of them looked for loopholes or made it rather difficult for minorities to enroll in these schools. Colleges and universities, in particular, this was going to be true for. And so, what's going to happen is in 1962, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, which to this day is arguably the strongest of all these groups, it's one of the few that lasts throughout the entire civil rights movement, started beforehand, is going to keep going. They are going to actually pursue legal means, get court orders in order to further institute the desegregation laws. And they're going to start with the University of Mississippi and trying to get a man by the name of James Meredith enrolled. Meredith was seeking to become, a college, I think it was a freshman, and they were making it at the University of Mississippi so that he couldn't even fill out the registration paperwork. It finally took two federal officials to go with Meredith in order to keep him safe enough just to try to register. But Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett is personally going to prevent him. He's going to do stuff like order the doors to lock for the registration building on campus, lose his paperwork, all these types of really suspicious, really awful, undermining ways. That being said, Meredith is going to keep trying to seek ways to register. Everything from suing the school to making sure having officials go in and fill out the paperwork for him. So finally, it got to the point where on the evening of September 30th, a huge riot is going to break out on campus over whether or not Meredith should be allowed to enroll. In this riot, 2 people are killed and 375 are injured. This is going to be kind of a wake-up call for everybody in the area. Hey, you know what? This is really extreme. We just got a kid who's trying to go to school. So he is going to register for classes the next day. Now he's starting late, but that being said, he is going to attend the university all the way until his graduation in 1963. And so he becomes the first black student to graduate from the University of Mississippi. And that's pretty triumphant. Keep in mind he was very often going to be teased, taunted, harassed, tripped, bullied, and he put up with it and he still graduated. Now, nonviolent protests didn't always work. Nonviolence is obviously a great method, but it can often be overlooked. In some places, for example, as soon as people started protesting, the police just came in, arrested him, threw him in jail. You can't do very much good if you're sitting in jail because then you're not getting your publicity, you're not getting your message across. There was a time where Martin Luther King was going to come down and purposely try to get himself to be jailed because he knew he was high profile, and so this would bring a lot of attention to it. In this instance, Georgia Police Chief Lori Pritchett is going to respond simply by releasing King. No, don't let him get the media exposure that King wants. Don't let him have that satisfaction. And so it's going to get to the point where the police are finding ways that they're almost trying to poke the protesters into using violence, and then that would become a justification to not listen to the protesters. So what's going to happen is the SCLC leaders, they're going to learn that progress only works when the protests kind of blended violence and nonviolence. Start with nonviolence. As soon as violence is used towards you, then you might have to find some form of slight violence in response. And they're going to try this theory out in Birmingham, Alabama. They're going to start by using a series of boycotts and marches and sit-ins, all relatively nonviolent, right? They're just going to, I'm going to sit at this counter, or I'm going to take a little parade, hand out some leaflets, those types of things. They get arrested. The problem is that when these people start getting arrested, these protesters start getting arrested, it's really going to cut into the number of people willing to protest because you don't want to get arrested, clearly. And so by the end of April, the number of protesters is going to decrease. Some are sitting in jail, and others have left the movement because they don't want to put their jobs or their reputations or their family's safety or any of that at stake. in order to keep the protest momentum flowing, the SCLC are then going to turn to kids. They're going to turn to young adolescents, 1,000 of them, and have them march in the city streets. Because who's going to arrest a kid? Well, the people of Birmingham. 600 of these 1,000 youths were arrested on May 2nd, 1963. The next day, the police, the remaining 400 youth show up the next day to continue their marches and demonstrations. They're not using violence. The next day, police are going to use dogs, fire hoses, and nightsticks to beat these kids. And this time, the protesters had called the media out. They were like, hey, we're going to have a parade this day. Why don't you come and cover it for us? The media came and caught images of police battering children who were having a parade with the proper permits filed, mind you. This is going to increase awareness and sympathy for the protesters. So this is obviously going to only help the movement of the protesters trying to get some racial equality. Ultimately, this is when JFK starts to become more serious in his civil rights efforts as well. He's really going to look at all of this stuff that's happening and realize, yeah, I'm dealing with all this stuff with the Cold War, but I really need to do something with my own domestic issues. And we talked about, he had sympathies, he certainly did, for what these people were going through. It was really hard for him to find this balance. And so he's going to turn to Congress and he's going to try to ask them to pass meaningful legislation to end desegregation in public facilities. He's like, it's not good enough for us to simply say, oh, we should. We need to actually write laws with penalties attached to it that are going to make the situation in the South a lot better. And we need to actually enforce these. The problem was that Congress was not going to support this. We've talked about JFK and Congress did not have the best of relationships. And in general, there were a lot of people in Congress who just did not support, his goals. Martin Luther King knew this. So in order to try to raise public support for the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and the SCLC and the SNDCC, QYZ, all these different groups, right? They're all going to come together and say, let's have a giant march in Washington, D.C. We're going to march to D.C., spend the night there, and then let's have a whole bunch of people make a whole bunch of speeches on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, right? This is Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. How much freedom had they achieved since then? Let's meet on, and that's why they chose this symbolic place. Meet on those steps, and let's just make speeches and show that there is indeed public support for these reforms, and that would make the people of Congress say, oh, I better listen to my constituents and work towards some form of meaningful legislation. And this becomes known as the March on Washington. 200,000 people are going to gather that day on August 28, 1963. This is, if you've seen Forrest Gump, it's when Jenny runs into the National Memorial Pond and starts screaming Forrest's name. That didn't probably actually happen, but there were a lot of what we would call hippies, musicians, poets, and all these types of people who were there, and all they were doing is it was kind of a giant peace rally, and it's going to culminate in the closing with Martin Luther King making his famous I have a dream speech. I have a dream that one day everything is going to be better. And so that was the goal of this March on Washington. It was so idealistic. In response, it was considered a success because it does raise a lot of hopes of the civil rights workers. A lot of people are going to say, you know what? That was really, nice, peaceful. Lots of people were there. They all got along well. Let's work for this. Let's make this happen. And so there was I'll call it a detente. It just means like a thawing. Things did calm down in terms of the racial hatred and the race riots and crimes for a little while, just for a little while. Within a couple of weeks, however, things heated back up. Violence is going to continue. You're going to have lynching in the South where they're beating and hanging, black people or white people sympathetic towards black people. Black churches were being bombed. There were threats made against the lives of Martin Luther King as well as other leaders of the civil rights movement. The NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers is even going to be killed. He's assassinated. And so there was this moment of hope, this glimmer of hope with this March on Washington, but it only lasts for a brief second. And then JFK himself, he gets assassinated, November 22nd, 1963. And that assassination ushers in President Johnson, and there's this whole uncertainty of, well, what's going to happen now with the civil rights movement? We knew with JFK, he at least had sympathies. He wasn't being very successful in getting legislation passed, but he was trying. What's Johnson going to do? Here is Evers and his wife mourning at his grave and his young children. So you got Johnson as president now. What is Johnson going to be like in terms of the civil rights movement? Well, he's actually going to be very good for the civil rights movement. He is going to be successful in passing the legislation that JFK had wanted, yet had been unable to pass himself. On July 22nd, 1964, Johnson signs into law the Civil Rights Act of '64, which is one of the biggest civil rights laws passed in U.S. history ever. Like, even during Reconstruction, this was a biggie. And what it does is it outlaws discrimination in jobs and in any public facility due to race. It said you're not allowed to not let somebody ride a bus or sit at a counter or be hired because they happen to be a different race than you. Race is no longer allowed to be an issue in any of that. And it gave the Justice Department the power to bring lawsuits to enforce desegregation. So it allowed for easier lawsuits to be filed. It allowed for different groups to use force when necessary to enforce the desegregation policies and laws. So this was actually a very big step in the civil rights movement. And one of the things that is going to become apparent is that voting rights in general were one of those other areas that needed to be addressed. All right, great. You're not going to be you're not going to be segregated against in terms of employment. You're not going to be segregated against in terms of public facilities. But what about voting? There was a lot of areas in the South that were making it so that black people couldn't vote. And that was illegal. They had earned the right to vote, after the Civil War. We had passed a whole bunch of constitutional amendments that said, oh, black people are citizens, and oh, they do have the right to vote. So what had happened is there were a series of these acts that were done mostly in the South, but not always, that ranged from literacy taxes that black and poor white people could not afford. They had poll taxes. They had to pass reading tests. They had to do all this stuff to register where they'd have to go to the courthouse and fill out the paperwork, and they would close when a black person would walk in. So there are all sorts of ways that they prevented black people from having the right to vote. In Mississippi, for example, while 40% of the state's population were African Americans, only 5% were eligible to vote. Only 5%. They had been able to go and fill out the paperwork. That's all. That's not counting how many actually were able to, once they filled out the paperwork, go cast a ballot, right? That's just the amount of people who had registered. So what's going to happen is civil rights leaders are going to decide to try to go after that next. Make voter registration easier, more fair, and more just. And they're just randomly going to pick the city of Macomb. And why? Well, Macomb had 12,000 citizens and only 250 registered black voters. And again, this is one of those places that we're using literacy tests as a means of preventing black suffrage. And so the goal here is going to be for the various civil rights groups to try to make it so that Macomb would allow the black people to register to vote, and then once they were allowed to register, make it so that they actually literally could walk into a ballot place and cast their vote. How successful is it going to be, however?